Sega and Nintendo duked things out in the console wars of the 90s, and kids back then knew how important it was to like the right console. Funnily enough, people still seem to be fighting those console wars online today, and you can find people talking about how the Super Nintendo outclasses the Genesis in every way, including the sound. Of course, plenty of people still root for the underdog, and that's why I'm here, because while I acknowledge that the Super Nintendo has some of the best 16-bit soundtracks out there, the Genesis doesn't deserve to have its reputation tarnished. The Genesis had an onboard FM synthesizer. Composers had to know what they were doing to make the Genesis sound great, and frankly, many didn't. But there were some masterful composers who really knew how to make the sound chip in the Genesis sing, and somehow I had so many of their games as a kid by coincidence that I never understood how anyone could say the Genesis sounded bad. Almost all Genesis owners had Sonic the Hedgehog, especially the first two games, which were pack-ins, and also some of the best-selling games on the console. Sega chose Japanese bassist Masato Nakamura to compose music for the first game, and hired him again for the sequel after fans praised the original's music. And who can deny the greatness of the Green Hill Zone track, which is probably the most iconic instrumental track in the entire franchise? But ever since I was a kid, Starlight Zone always stuck out to me as the best track in the game. It turns out that Nakamura actually borrowed some melodies from his band Dreams Come True. Check out Kusuri Yubi no Kesshin to hear Starlight Zone's melody in a J-pop song. Then there's Sweet Sweet Sweet, which is more than a borrowed melody. According to Wikipedia, citing an interview with Nakamura, the song is explicitly a version of the Sonic 2 credits theme. But my favorite from the sequel is Chemical Plant Zone. But let's jump ahead a bit to the breakdown. Listen to that bass. So could something that funky really come out of a console that sounds bad? I don't think so. Speaking about funky, I think the Toejam and Earl games are what I'd call hidden gems, and the wacky aliens are probably what spurred my dad into buying these games. They have some of the most unique and just plain fun soundtracks on the Genesis. I can't find too much information about their composer, John Baker, but I can infer that he worked really darn hard to make the Genesis sound as funky as possible. Just check out the main theme from the series. And if we go back a couple years to listen to a track from the original, we can see that even in 1991, Baker knew what he was doing with the Genesis sound chip. Now this next game, I remember choosing at the store based solely on its name and cover art. I bet it's the game that a lot of Genesis fans have been waiting for me to talk about in this video, Streets of Rage 2. Now I've played the first and third games too, but I only had Streets of Rage 2 as a kid. Is it the best one? I don't know, but I think it might have had the best soundtrack in the trilogy. Streets of Rage fans, tell me if I'm wrong. Now this might be the best soundtrack on my list. Yuzo Koshiro is legendary in the video game music scene, and he's still pumping out soundtracks almost yearly to this day. But even back then, he brought the best out of the Genesis's sound chip. For Streets of Rage in particular, he used an audio programming language that he wrote himself. So in addition to his raw talent in musicianship, he also had programming expertise. It makes me wish that I'd had more Genesis games that he'd composed for back when I was a kid, but honestly, Streets of Rage 2 was enough to convince me of his talent. Enough blabbering, let's listen. Like I mentioned, I'm only talking about games I had as a kid in the 90s, and since I was a kid, I had some kids games. Now, most people talk about Castle of Illusion, but all I had was its sequel, World of Illusion. I don't know if it's nostalgia, but I find this game more fun than Castle of Illusion, which I only played as an adult. But anyways, another great sounding game. This one composed by Haruyo Oguro and Tomoko Sasaki. This one stuck with me because the instruments, if I can call them that, always sounded great to me. They don't sound exactly like real instruments, but I think they sound great coming from a 16-bit console nonetheless. Now, while we are on the topic of kids games, my dad picked up 2 edutainment games for little kid me, likely to justify the expense of a video game console to my mom. It's for the kids, right? Anyways, I don't know if I'd call the soundtracks great, but I'm including them because they had so much speech.
Welcome to Busytown. Climb on board the Applecopter and fasten your seatbelts. Would you take care of the deli while I'm gone? Sure, brother.
Remember, this was back when the Sega chant helped make the Genesis stand out because it took up a full 1/8 of the Sonic 1 game cartridge. This much talking just wasn't seen in games back then, at least on home consoles, so it helped make the Genesis stand out, especially in my eyes. Now, maybe there were Super Nintendo games with lots of talking, but I didn't know about them, and I can't actually think of any off the top of my head. Leave me a comment if you know any that compare to these Genesis games. Anyways, of course the console exclusives sound great. It was ports that demonstrated the inferiority of the Genesis, right? But I also had a few ports on the Genesis, and they still did not detract from my opinion. Fox Williams ported Bubble and Squeak to the Genesis from the Amiga, a computer system well known for its great sound. Well, maybe it was. I'm not super familiar with the computer scene of the 80s and the 90s, but either way, the Genesis does it justice in my opinion. As for the game itself, I've never heard anyone else talk about this game much at all. I feel like I'm the only one who had it in the 90s, which means that Sega fans everywhere missed out on an opportunity to shove this soundtrack by Alistair Brimble into the faces of Nintendo fans. My dad also picked up another fun Amiga port for the Genesis, Lemmings 2: The Tribes, which developer DMA Design also ported to the Super Nintendo. Now, I'm not going to do a comparison because this is not the Genesis sounds better than the Super Nintendo, it's just about the Genesis sounding great to me in the 90s. Now, some games that are on both of the major 16-bit consoles have people who will vouch for either version of the soundtrack. Earthworm Jim is one, but of course, most people in the 90s only ever played one of the 2 versions, and I played the Genesis version. It's got a great soundtrack composed by Mark Miller, and he definitely knew how to play to the strengths of the Genesis. The first level's theme is pretty funky, but I think my favorite track is this one. I did give this track a listen on the Super Nintendo, and it might just be my nostalgia talking, but I think it's not nearly as impressive as the Genesis version. But either way, the Super Nintendo is known for its amazing RPG soundtracks, so let's check out an RPG. Ys 3: Wanderers from Ys. Somehow, I ended up with one of the few, if not only, RPGs on the Genesis that was ported from Japanese computers to both major 16-bit consoles. And I don't think it's just the nostalgia talking here. After listening to both for a bit, I think the Genesis version is superior. And since this soundtrack gets so much love on both consoles, I guess I'll do a comparison here. This is the track that plays in the first dungeon, and it's an action RPG, so it's a pretty lively track. Here's the Super Nintendo version first. And here's the Genesis version. I'd never heard the Super Nintendo version as a kid because why would you own the same game on 2 consoles, but you tell me, which one is better? Because for me, it's clearly the Genesis version. Leave a comment if I'm wrong, or if I'm right. I like those comments too. For the last game that appeared on both major 16-bit consoles, kind of, I had Disney's Aladdin by Virgin Games, which is not a port, but a completely different game than Capcom's Aladdin game on the Super Nintendo. Now, I've never actually played the Capcom game, so I have no idea which one is more fun, but the soundtrack by Tommy Tallarico and Donald Griffin, featuring arranged music from the film, kept my impressions of the sound capabilities of the Genesis nice and high. I'm starting to run out of games I had as a kid here, but I still don't have any bad sounding games like some detractors like to say plagued the Genesis. Let's move on to another exclusive that really plays to the strengths of the Genesis. Gauntlet 4, co-composed by Hitoshi Sakimoto and Masaharu Iwata, demonstrates the capabilities of the Genesis to pump out amazing RPG soundtracks like the Super Nintendo was known for. These composers went on to co-compose soundtracks for many other games for years to come, including RPGs like Final Fantasy Tactics and Final Fantasy XII. Just give this a listen. Does it stand up to Final Fantasy VI? I don't know if I'd go that far, but as a kid, I hadn't heard of Final Fantasy until 7 made the series a household name, but this track kept popping up in my mind even though I hadn't played the game in years, maybe more than a decade, and I'd always rack my brain trying to figure out which amazing RPG it came from. Gauntlet 4, which isn't that great of an RPG, but that soundtrack. As we get to the end of my childhood games and why I thought the Genesis sounded great, let's go back to Sonic, but with a different composer. Sonic 3's soundtrack is a bit of a mess, and tons of people have covered that topic on YouTube already. But basically, Sonic's composer for the other two games, Masato Nakamura, raised his price, and Sega said, we might as well ask Michael Jackson to compose the soundtrack instead if you want that much money. So Sega began producing the music with their in-house sound team, but it turns out Michael Jackson actually was interested in composing for the game, and worked on the soundtrack for free. But in the end, Jackson didn't like the quality of the sound output and chose to remove some of the tracks and remain uncredited. His sound team and Sega's sound team got the credit, and a lot of key tracks are missing from modern ports of the game because they were written by Jackson's crew, who are presumably pretty expensive to license. Anyways, I'll play a little clip from a track by Jackson's team. And a clip from Sega's team. No matter which team it is, they both knew how to make the Genesis sound great. And maybe not as great as a record player or CD player like Jackson might have wanted, but great to my gamer ears. The final game I had as a kid that made me think the Genesis sounded great was Sonic 3D Blast. Now, not that great of a game, but lots of great tracks, including a couple composed by Jun Senue and Tatsuyuki Maeda that were so good they reused them in Sonic Adventure on the Dreamcast. My favorite was the secondary boss theme, also by Senue. These are pretty much all the games I had as a kid. Most of the others were arcade ports and compilations because my dad wanted me to experience the games he played when he was younger. I guess the cycle continues with me talking about old games here, but tell me what you think. I know the Super Nintendo had some great soundtracks, but I don't think even the biggest Nintendo fanboys can say that the Genesis sounds bad after listening to these tracks. I know that it had its share of bad ports and developers who just didn't care to learn the hardware, but if you played the right games, you were in for a treat in the sound department. And it's this collection of games that I just happened to have that coincidentally all used the sound chip masterfully, to the point that I never understood why people could say that the Genesis sounds bad at all. In fact, as I say all my sign-off stuff, I'm not even going to play my channel's theme. You guys can listen to another great Genesis track from Sonic 3D Blast. Thank you so much for watching. I look forward to you all telling me about what games I missed out on in the 90s, but you don't have to tell me about terrible soundtracks on the Genesis. I don't need my opinions shattered. Either way, if you want to see more stuff like this, remember to leave a like and a comment on the video so I know what people are interested in seeing more of from me. Until next time, I hope you have an awesome day and an awesome week.